Welcome to No Alter Egos, the place for conversation without the mask. As always, we are proudly broadcast on WHPB 98.5 The Wire in Pine Hills, Florida, WUVS 103.7 The Beat in Muskegon, Michigan, and WVBH LP Power 105.3 in Benton Harbor, Michigan. We have another great week coming up for you guys. I am your host, Trll Kennedy, and I am just super excited to bring you guys a bit of news. So we're coming up on the 1-year anniversary of the show, and it all started off a year ago on a small station here in Pine Hills, Florida, but a station that I love, and that is WHPB 98.5 The Wire. They gave me my first opportunity, and I'm proud to say that we're almost a year into the show, and to see the steady growth that has been happening as the show has gone on, to see how people have been reaching out and connecting, how the words are really resonating, I'm really happy and excited to not only see that, but to be able to announce to you guys that the podcast is going to be available very soon on demand. In addition to being available on YouTube, we're going to start filming a video companion. So it's going to be a podcast as well as a video podcast. So for those that would like to either, just put a face to the voice, or if you find yourself on YouTube more often than not, it's going to be available on YouTube as well as a native platform for podcasts. We're going to get into some details on that in a little bit. It's also going to be available in due time on your favorite podcasting apps. So whether that's Apple, Spotify, Stitcher, whatever the case may be, it's going to be available on those platforms as well. We just wanted to be able to give you guys a multitude and a plethora of ways to be able to connect with the show. So this week, as always, we're going to be talking about some of the current events that have been going on, especially this crisis over in the Ukraine. Obviously, we talked a little bit last week, and for those who are just now tuning in or seeing this for the first time on the YouTube channel, I want to say welcome to the show. Like and subscribe, please, if you like what you're hearing. I think you're going to enjoy the content. We do a weekly radio show. It's going to be a weekly podcast now with a video component that's going to be hosted here on YouTube. And yeah, I just love to be able to provide some more great content to you guys. And the likes and the subscribes help with the YouTube algorithm. If you could also hit that notification bell so that you'll be notified whenever we post new content, because I won't only be posting new full episodes every week, but we'll also be posting different snippets of the show throughout the week to give you guys something to connect to. I'm really excited to be able to just bring this to you guys and to have that available. Moving forward though, let's get into our topics this week. So as I said, we have the crisis that's been going on in the Ukraine. And one of the biggest things to me that I've found is that President Putin may have made a literal as well as a figurative comical miscalculation of the Ukraine's president, Volodymyr Zelensky. He's literally a former comic. He was the voice of Paddington Bear in the Ukrainian reboot of the movie, or not reboot, in the Ukrainian translation of the movie. And he has really garnered a ton of attention for himself on the world stage with the way that he's been handling the crisis so far. Obviously not maybe from a military standpoint, because militarily the Ukraine is far weaker than Russia, but especially with the propaganda arm and the way that the war is being viewed by the world at large. How many countries have come to not only support the Ukraine, but who have worked to provide economic sanctions to a really harsh degree against not only the Russian state, but against the oligarchs that are part of the kleptocracy. We're going to be getting into that in just a second. We're also going to be talking about the fact that those oligarchs are being hit with sanctions. I got to tell you guys, like, for me personally, it's not even necessarily any ill will. I have no ill will towards them, but I also don't feel sorry for them. I don't feel sorry for the people that have historically aligned themselves with Vladimir Putin, who have allowed him to grow in his despotism and to lead Russia off what seems to be this economic and political cliff, because he's a madman that is fascinated by and fascinated with gaining power and money for himself and those who worship him and who he may call friends. But I really think that someone like a Vladimir Putin is not capable of having friends. He's not someone who's capable of knowing what friendship means. He only knows power and self-interest, much like a lot of people who I would say are in leadership positions around the world. But he's someone who has clearly taken it to another level and degree. I'm also going to be talking about something I touched on last week in the show. And once again, for those who are just seeing the video component for the first time, we're coming up on our 1-year anniversary in just 3 weeks time after this episode. We are also going to be It's going to be our 52nd episode, and we're also just going to be delving into some of the highs and lows of the past year. But I want to make the case for something that I spoke about last week, which is the case for racism being a form of mass psychosis, societal psychosis, something so insidious that has so pervasively invaded the hearts and minds of so many people that it has become ingrained into people's DNA on a very deep, almost feral level, to the point where they can't, it's not even like they can't recognize it within themselves. They refuse to recognize it within themselves, and they refuse to recognize it within others unless those others are burning crosses and literally saying the N-word to other people. It's almost more offensive for people to be called racist and called out on their racist actions than for them to actually look in the mirror and say, what are the blind spots? So we're going to make the case for racism as a form of mass psychosis. And we're going to wrap things up with the case against war as an economic tool. And now there's something I want to get into in this episode as well, which has been the fact that we're seeing right now economic tools being used as an instrument of war against the Kremlin, against Vladimir Putin and his Russian government. But this specifically will be a case against war itself and how it has historically been used as an economic tool, especially in modern history. So we're going to delve back into some classical history, come all the way up to modern times, and then see when things really got ramped up and how war became part and parcel of world economies, because that's really the case and situation. I don't know. I'm not going to say I don't know how it got there. I don't know why it was the choice of so many world leaders years ago to use it in that manner, but it has been. And to this point in time, we have seen its consequences play out over and over and over again. But in countries where, and this is something I alluded to in our previous episode, we've seen it happen in countries where the people don't have the right look, if you will, for Western journalism. So if it happens in countries in Africa, it's just, oh, well, they're savages anyways. They still live in brick huts and they don't know anything. So when refugees are being created by the millions and tens of millions over in Africa, it's not even a blip on the news radar. When it happens in the Middle East, it's just, oh, well, those people are always fighting with each other. So once again, if there's something bad, like there was a terrorist attack or a bombing that took place at a Shiite mosque in Pakistan, you know, it may make some headlines, but once again, it's not going to make the news headlines. Although those are people, they are human beings, their suffering should count. And yet traditionally, it just doesn't. So we're going to get into the case against war, actual literal war, as an economic tool, which is something that it has been for at least the past 70 to 80 years, if not a little bit longer. And we're going to get into why that took place, why decisions were made to continue to keep it as an economic tool, and how we can maybe escape this endless cycle of constant conflict around the world, driven by both governmental interests and also corporate interests, which are really just the personal interests of really, really, really ridiculously rich corporate owners and board members. But yeah, that's our show coming up today. Super excited to bring it to you guys. But before we get into things, I'm proud to announce that today's episode is brought to you, as always, by Born Saint Clothing and Merchandise. The world makes us sinners, but we are born saints. For more information on Born Saint Clothing and Merchandise, if you're watching this on YouTube to get a cool looking hoodie like this, please feel free to visit them at brn.saint. That's Born Saint with no O on Instagram, or go to www.trllkennedy.com/shop with no I in Trill. And yeah, man, as always, want to give them a big shout out. If you want to connect with me, feel free to follow me on Instagram. Reach out to my DMs. It's at Trll Kennedy. That's TRLL KENNEDY. You can check out some of the music that I've been making over my career, as well as hear from me or speak and converse with me about what we talk about here on the show. And finally, to get in contact with the show, reach out to us at No Alter Egos. That's No Alter Egos, NOALTEREGOS, on both Instagram and Facebook. And for everyone watching this on YouTube, or if you're hearing the podcast and you want to subscribe to the YouTube channel, it's just the No Alter Egos podcast on YouTube. That's the channel name. And yeah, let's get into it, man. So as I said, this conflict in the Ukraine has just been really fascinating to see it play out in real time. Because of course, when it first started, it was, I'm not going to say shocking to see, It wasn't a surprise that President Putin made the move. If we all remember, 8 years ago, back in 2014, in the middle of President Obama's second term, they invaded the Crimea and essentially took that territory over from the Ukraine. And he didn't really face a ton of consequences, at least any real consequences back then. More economic sanctions. So what did he do? He thought that he sanction-proofed Russia's economy. They started storing up money. They made sure that they were one of the biggest exporters of oil and natural gas in the world to keep themselves relevant on the world economic stage. And we're going to get into why countries are able to even do that, why we still have so many economies and governments that base a ton of their power on the economic resource of oil or natural gas, why the energy sector is such a big driver of geopolitics. But we're going to get into that momentarily. What we saw when President Putin back then went and invaded the Crimea, took it over, was a man whose ambitions, is not going to say knew no bounds, but he at least showed himself to be a student of history, knowing that Russia and the Ukraine had been historically linked for quite some time, well over a half a millennium now. Those two states, countries, cities, Kyiv has been a city for quite some time. You have Moscow that has been a city for quite some time. There's been a ton of history between the two of them, and historically, the Ukraine, I'm not going to say was always a part of Russia, but was certainly closely linked to Russia. Ukraine is a modern state in terms of its existence as a state, just like how Turkey used to be the Ottoman Empire up until about a century ago at the end of World War I. There are a ton of modern nation states that were creations of the 20th century, especially when you talk about the Middle East. They were creations of a map that was redrawn in the aftermath of World War I, or the Great War, as it was known back then. But President Putin invaded the Crimea, claiming that Russia had some kind of historical right to it. And so we saw a man who was like, okay, his ambitions are pretty clear. He feels as though he has a right to own this. He wants to do what he wants to do with it. And at the end of the day, he's going to do what he wants to do with it. And so when we saw that, he signaled to the world, this is who I am, and there's probably going to be more to come. Now, what he did was he waited until President Obama was out of office. Of course, then came the election of Donald Trump. And I think it was Donald Trump's election that really gave President Putin a kind of like boost to the ego in terms of, okay, I can manipulate affairs in one of the most powerful nations on earth. And he didn't even have to try that hard. When we talk about Russian interference in our 2016 election, it was interference to a small degree, yes, but what they really did was they saw the opportunity for a snowball, and so they just rolled the snowball down the hill. They counted on and relied on the fact that there were already these winds of change taking place in conservative movements that were rooted in racism, xenophobia, we can call all those things, and they saw the opportunity to sow discord into American society by playing that same old chord. We forget, racism almost tore this country apart. The Civil War, we keep talking about this lost cause myth and how the South just wanted to fight for states' rights, but the rights that those states were fighting for were the right to keep other human beings in subjugation. And I'm going to get to that when we get to talking about racism as a form of mass psychosis. I've been reading through Shelby Foote's narration and narrative of the Civil War, and it is fascinating to see how these people believed they were fighting for their freedom, while at the same time their freedom was the freedom to subjugate an entire race of people to inhuman slavery, to treat them as chattel, as property. It's a fascinating study on the human mind and how something so insidious can become such a massive blind spot to so many parts of the population that they don't even see that what they're doing is wrong, But anyways, I digress. So President Putin, he invades. Donald Trump gets elected after a nice little nudge from the Russians. And we are at this point now in history where he's sitting and waiting to see if Donald Trump's going to get a second term. He doesn't, but Joe Biden replaces him. And Vladimir Putin does not see Joe Biden as necessarily the strongest leader. He sees him certainly not as the pawn that he wanted in office, but he's not someone who he feels extraordinarily intimidated by. And so we see the invasion of Ukraine almost 2 weeks now in the making. They come in, they storm the capital city, they storm some other key cities. Now, they have not broken down all of the Ukraine's defenses. So when I say they stormed the capital city, they certainly did attempt to storm it, but they were rebuffed by civilian fighting, by people who stayed behind to defend their homeland. And as I said last week, it has been such a fascinating study to see the way that Western news media and outlets have treated this particular situation in the Ukraine, labeling it as an invasion, as they should. But it's also interesting to see how that's never the case for other countries like Yemen, like Palestine, like certain countries in Africa. We don't like to talk about that stuff, but it's just little things I pay attention to. So a fascinating read on this subject is actually Propaganda and the Public Mind, as well as Manufacturing Consent. Both wonderful books that really expound on the subject of the purposes that large mass media generally serves. But anyways, I find it hilarious because right now, what we're seeing is that Vladimir Putin may have severely underestimated his opponent in President Volodymyr Zelensky of the Ukraine. And as Russian forces try to storm Kyiv, Kharkiv, and some of the other major cities in the Ukraine, and as we see Russian soldiers who some are saying, well, we were told this is a military exercise, as some of them are getting their tanks blown up. We saw the viral video of the woman offering to put sunflower seeds in the soldier's pocket, saying that he should put them there so that when he dies, at least some flowers can sprout up from where his body lays. Like just real crazy stuff like that. But President Putin, I think, severely underestimated his rival, his governmental rival in President Zelensky. And I think a lot of the world underestimated him too. This is a man who, as I said at the beginning of the show, is a former comic, someone who does voiceover acting and did the voice of a beloved children's character in the Ukrainian version of the movie, and who was elected president after he realized that he wanted to do more for his country. He's of Jewish descent, and to this point, he has shown himself to be one of the stronger and more charismatic leaders on the world stage. And I don't think Vladimir Putin thought that that was going to be the response that President Zelensky gave. He thought he was going to fold. I guarantee you he thought he was going to fold. And we have now this point where it's not necessarily a stalemate, because once again, Russia clearly has the advantage when it comes to military might and strength. They have the second largest nuclear arsenal on the planet outside of the United States. And they're run, if we're not mincing words here, by a madman and former spy. Someone who, at the very minimum, is a sociopath, but at worst is a psychopath who's hell-bent on running such a large portion of the world that he can't be challenged. And if he doesn't do so, with him being at the helmets of such a large nuclear arsenal, we can't put it past him to maybe deploy nuclear weaponry, which really has not been used to that degree outside of tests since the United States showed that we were the people who were willing to use nuclear weapons against sovereign citizens when we dropped 2 of them on the island nation of Japan to try and end World War II, which it successfully did. It was a heck of a deterrent, but it ushered in this new age where we realized we could potentially destroy all life on the planet. And I think mutually assured destruction has been this thing where it's like, well, we have them just in case, but no one's ever going to use them. The problem with that kind of a thought process, though, is that you could end up with a psychopath who doesn't care whether they live or die, who's in charge of these caches of weapons, like a Vladimir Putin is. And then the entire world is held hostage by the whims of a madman. So that is where we're at. But as I said, it has been hilarious to me to see not only Vladimir Putin's fall from grace on the world stage, but the fact that it's happening both literally and figuratively at the hands of a former comic. You can't make this stuff up. But President Zelensky has been winning on the propaganda front. We dabbed into this a little bit last week, and it has been, it's been interesting, to say the very least, to see the responses from the rest of the world. Because right now we're seeing, I believe, a new form of warfare, which is economic warfare. So a lot of us don't understand that when these countries go to war, we're so used to seeing the carnage and the brutality, and we're still seeing that. But I think this new generation of world leaders is kind of sick of it. And I think they're sick of it because with the advent of social media, there are many people now around the world who are far more hesitant to go off into foreign countries killing each other. It's not to say that there aren't still people who are willing or who aren't willing to go and fight for their countries. But I'm gonna be honest, even for someone like me, like, No, I don't have a ton of interest in going and killing a stranger on a on foreign soil for the glory of the United States. Because at the end of the day, I've learned too much about our country's history to think and be tricked into thinking that what I'd be doing over on that soil is something ultra noble. It'd be questionable at best, because I know what our presidents have done in the past with our military, the purposes that they've used them for. And we're going to get into that into more detail when we talk about the case against war as an economic tool. But I think enough world leaders at this point have seen how war has devastated countries in the past, how Laos and Cambodia are still suffering from the effects decades later of mass dumping of Agent Orange to try and clear out the jungle, to try and destroy farmland. You know, they're still suffering from the millions of landmines that were placed all over their countries, where people still are dying at an alarming rate annually from accidentally stepping on or coming into contact with land ordinances. And knowing and understanding that, and once again, I think that comes from people being at the point where they're like, no, we're not gonna fight these wars for you. Now we're seeing a shift and a change in policy, where instead of responding with military force, they respond with economic force. And so we're at this point now where Russia is being literally cut off from the rest of the world economy. So major corporations and businesses, governments and banks, everyone is literally cutting Russia off. And the sanctions have hit out at the richest of the rich in Russia. And I'm going to talk about that next, because I think it's interesting to see and note the way that warfare is being transformed right before our very eyes, from traditional blow everything up warfare into economic warfare on a level as such to stoke hatred and resentment of whatever world leader decides to go into an unjust war. So that and more is coming up right now as we jump into our next topic. So let's talk about these sanctions that have been taking place against the Russian oligarchy and this kleptocracy that they've been running on the nation ever since the collapse of the Soviet Union. That's one of those things that I find doesn't get discussed too much. So we have, of course, the Chernobyl nuclear disaster that takes place in 1986 over in the Ukraine, which was at the time a part of the Soviet Union. The Chernobyl disaster takes place, and 4 years later, the Soviet Union gets dissolved. The USSR is no more. One of the things that's not ever really regarded by at least the common public historically is the fact that the Chernobyl nuclear disaster was one of the catalyzing factors in not only the decline, but the eventual destruction of the Soviet Union. We forget that radiation levels, especially all over Western Europe, spiked during this disaster. And there was so much fallout and loss of trust in the capability of leaders in the Soviet state that it was left with no choice but to dissolve. And so with its dissolution in 1990, you have new elections for the first time really since the Bolshevik Revolution in 1917. And that's another one. So I'm a very curious person. I love reading because, and I say this all the time, but to be honest with you, our world wouldn't make any sense to me if I didn't have books, especially books on history, because what I see going on around us would just be madness to me. It'd all be insane. But history lends a sense of context to the seemingly insane way that a lot of world leaders conduct themselves in the business of their countries. A lot of people don't take the time to acknowledge that Russia was essentially the last European peasant society. They were the last to really come out of the Dark Ages or the feudal ages. It was 1917 with the advent of the Bolshevik Revolution where peasants really began to try and lift themselves out of the real depths of poverty that they had lived in for hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of years. And so with that framing the context for what then took place after the Bolshevik Revolution, where we saw, instead of a royal family handling the affairs of the country, now an elite took over. We saw what I like to call communal fascism, which is use of state power in control of state resources to suppress any and everything. It's the reason why there's still a semi-effective case made against complete communism to this day. It's because of the fact that the Russian experiment, as it were, it failed on so many levels. Despots took over. And in 1990, at the dissolution of the Soviet Empire, the Soviet republics, whatever you want to call it, the Soviet Union, we saw a man step in Boris Yeltsin, to become the first, I guess, president of Russia in any kind of semi-democratic capacity. But then what happened immediately after that? What happened is oligarchs began to bleed the place. There's a documentary right now on Netflix, and I'm straining to remember the name. I'll post it on the screen to the YouTube when it comes to me. But there's a documentary on Netflix where they were almost able to procure a Russian nuclear submarine using drug money. Like, at the dissolution of the Soviet Union, it's like a fire sale. All these people came in, started seizing former state assets, and those who had money and maybe violent force to begin with, so the mafia and things like that, were able to come in, start seizing things from the state, and start selling them off on the black market to international criminals. And you had this trove of oligarchs that rose to power in the 1990s inside of Russia by preying on the remains of the former Soviet Union, using connections to government power and things like that to enrich themselves and to literally, in certain cases, kill off the competition or intimidate the competition out of business, so that you had this string of monopolies in different and varying sectors of industry within Russia. You had all these men that were able to come in, and it was essentially a giant land grab for different national resources and economic resources and things like that. And so you have these several companies that spring up, not necessarily during the 90s, but you have companies like Rosneft and things like that that spring up, and billionaire after billionaire is being minted in the remains of the former Soviet Union, which is now Russia, or the Russian Republic, right? And in the face of all of this, there is no real challenge. Vladimir Putin is playing behind the scenes. He's still very low in the political totem pole, but he's cunning and he's keen. He's a former member of the KGB, and he begins to slowly rise to power, starting off in some local elections and then getting into the inner circle eventually of Boris Yeltsin, to the point where he was essentially his deputy prime minister. And then, of course, we know with Boris Yeltsin stepping down in 1999, Vladimir Putin was elected then the president of Russia. One of the little known facts that also accompanies his election is the fact that British MI6, the British Secret Intelligence Service, assisted in his rise to power. It's something I believe they now deeply regret, but it's something that happened. We can talk about that truth. Anyways, so he gets elected as president of Russia. And barring a short stint where he stepped down for a second and gave someone else a chance to run the country, I believe it was a 4-year period, he's been the president of Russia ever since. And the people that made themselves billionaires in the 90s, that were essentially minting all this money from raiding what was left of their former country, they're all pals with him. And those who dissent against him are arrested, thrown in jail, some of them killed, some of them flee the country and have not gone back since. But we begin to see him strong-arming all competition out of the way. And in the meanwhile, he is allowed to continue doing these things for several reasons. The biggest of which is the fact that these incredibly wealthy and powerful people, the oligarchs of Russia, who ever since the dissolution, and really it was before the dissolution, but especially after the dissolution of the Soviet Union, they really turned into a kleptocracy club. So for those who don't know what a kleptocracy is, it's essentially where the richest people inside of a country are running that country as a personal bank for themselves. They're robbing a nation of its resources, money, and things of that nature to enrich themselves, and they are the people in power. So we have kleptomaniacs, thieves that can't help themselves, that continually steal. Well, in a kleptocracy, those are the people who are running the show. And so the US, we have a partial kleptocracy. We don't like to talk about it, but the truth of the matter is our natural resources are hoarded by several large corporations, especially when we talk about oil, natural gas, and things like that. It's just more open and on its face over in Russia. In America, we definitely have a more open and on its face oligarchy, because we have a system of legalized bribery. We just call it lobbying. Lobbying is literally legalized bribery. We can give money to these large law firms. They go to our Congress people and they write up the laws. They put the laws on the Congress people's desks and say, you need to get this passed, or coming up in the next election cycle, we're going to give $100,000, $200,000 to your opponent and give them the ability to take your job. Like, that's how politics works in our country. In Russia, it's more barren on its face. And because ever since the Cold War and the Red Scare, we've seen them as an opponent, even though they were on our side in World War II. It's just, anyways, that's just the reality and nature of things, is that there are oligarchies running a large chunk of the world. They're running our country, and they're running more openly the country of Russia, because those oligarchs who are friendly to Putin, who are supportive of his insane policies, they've kept him in power, and he's kept them incredibly wealthy. And so you have billionaires going and purchasing sports teams like Roman Abramovich, the former owner of the Brooklyn Nets, and soon to be former owner of Chelsea Football Club in England. Like, these people are going out and blowing through cash. The head of Rosneft just had his mega yacht seized by France. It's the largest vessel floating right now in the world. At least it will be until Jeff Bezos' mega yacht comes out of its Dutch shipyard. But like, these people not only robbed the state, but they made sure to buy their toys too. And so to see the sanctions that have been imposed upon them starting to hit some of them, and people having to sell assets and get rid of things, people having things like boats and yachts and apartments and things like that seized, I don't feel bad for them, because they aren't people that generally have consciences. I keep telling everyone this because it's the truth. It's a hard truth that I'd like a lot of people to acknowledge. And I don't know why it's the case in our society, why we've chosen this dynamic, but the people in charge of our societies are usually people lacking in consciences. I would not be going out on a limb if I ventured to say that 95% of people who have come into power through all of written and recorded history have been woefully underqualified and not of the right temperament to wield power. That's just the truth. The people that come into power in human society are generally not fit for it because they're hungry for it. And so they don't ever see power for what it is, which is a means to improve all of humanity, it's what it should be at most, is that we use the power that we gain and give each other politically to improve the lives of our fellow man. But literally 95% of the people who have come into political and economic power since the dawn of written history, and I'm sure even before that, have not been people qualified to hold and wield that power in any kind of decent or responsible way. And as a species, we've suffered the consequences for it historically. And so we're at this point now where we see people like a Roman Abramovich who are starting to suffer slightly because, he's going to have to sell his football club for around $4 billion. And he says he's going to donate the proceeds to the victims of the war, of the incursion and the invasion that's happening in the Ukraine. And it's meant to elicit and invoke our sympathies and be like, oh man, like, it's not his fault that he befriended a despot, but it is. He knows and has known who Vladimir Putin is. He has made fistfuls of money every second of every day for years, banking off of that man's despotism. He's come and he's spent that money in other nations, sure, but I'm not going to sit here and pretend like these people that cozy themselves up to a madman are just these good-hearted people that were led astray. No, they were intelligent enough to see who he was, to know who he was, and they chose to align themselves with him because he offered them an opportunity to make money and to come into power. And they took it and ran with it. And the sanctions, some say they go too far, say they don't go far enough. They've supported this regime long enough. And you know the only people that I really feel very bad for in this situation? The people of Russia. I do feel bad for the literal people of Russia, especially those who are totally against this war, who are finding that even as they go out into the streets to protest, they are met sometimes with force by Russian police force, which I don't understand that. I don't understand the whole law enforcement supporting whatever regime is in power, no matter what. Where are your morals and your conscience? But I do feel bad for the Russian people, especially those who aren't in support of this, because they don't have a say in whether or not the military goes to war. They didn't choose to send their military over there. Vladimir Putin did. And to the soldiers that are in the Ukraine, my question is, why? Why on earth are you following orders blindly? Why have you not laid down your arms? That's probably my biggest question. But if you ask me if I feel sorry for the billionaire jackoffs that have sat with this man and for years raped that country of its resources and raped the people for any of their chances of economic prosperity so they can put a few more dollars in their pocket, no, I'm not going to feel bad for them. I don't. I think it's asinine that you would ask anyone to. And yet and still, there have been some stories raised up in the media as to whether or not the sanctions are going too far and if the billionaires are really responsible for Vladimir Putin's behavior, as though they are somehow innocent parties caught up in the whims of a madman. No, I'm not buying it, bro. I'm not buying it. It's just not true on its face. The truth of the matter is, when you get together and align yourself with a mad dog, you know that the dog is mad. You're just hoping that madness never turns against you. That's what it is. And so right now, there are people dying on a daily basis because this insane person running the Russian government and the billionaire cronies that have upheld and supported his increasingly insane and asinine decisions over the years, he's finally making a move that pissed the rest of the world off. And it has been very interesting to see the response from the rest of the world, especially as they turn to economic measures as tools of warfare instead of the traditional bombs and guns. I do feel bad for the Russian people that are being cut off from everything. Apple, Samsung, Google, all of these large corporations have cut off their services and sales over in the country. Everyone is sealing Russia off from the rest of the world from an economic perspective. And yet, Putin persists. He keeps on. They're still attempting to invade, and people are being killed every day between shelling and fights on the streets. It's shameful, but it's the current state of affairs. But at any rate, we're going to keep things moving. As I said, you won't see me shedding any tears for billionaires, especially when they are billionaires that have helped to enable someone that is so beneath what any decent human being should be in the Russian president that we currently see exercising his insane whims on the nation of Ukraine. But let's move on to our third topic, because I really have wanted to get into this, and I'm excited to speak with you guys a little bit about this today, and that is the case for racism as a form of mass psychosis. It's something that I dabbled into slightly last week when I was talking about the fact that African, Indian, and other immigrants of color over in the Ukraine were facing harassment, certainly from small sections of the population, but mostly from law enforcement as they attempted to board buses and things like that, finding themselves being violently removed to prioritize white citizens fleeing the country. And I found it really disturbing to think that even in the face of war and imminent destruction, people couldn't help themselves from engaging in racist behaviors. It was the craziest thing to me, and it got me thinking. It's one of the reasons why I wanted to speak to you guys about it today, is because I'm still trying to figure out and wrap my mind around the whole thing. And I just began to delve deeper into the subject, and I've spoken on this before. I'm going to speak on it in a little more detail and from a slightly different perspective today, because racism, and I've talked about it being the greatest invention of the aristocracy, when they decided to have people really begin to categorize themselves according to skin color and ethnic background in a way to create castes within society and to ensure that there could never be a general mass uprising, because there's so much infighting beginning first and foremost on skin color that people will never figure out that you're being swindled by the richest people in your society. But at any rate, as I delve deeper, and as I've been reading through this Civil War, a narrative by Shelby Foote, and it's been a fascinating read. I just want to, if you haven't read it, it's written by Shelby Foote. He essentially compiled a gigantic, I believe at the end of it, it was almost 6,000 pages or over 6,000 pages long for the written copy. I have the audiobook, and so I've just been listening to the harrowing tales, and it chronicles the Civil War, beginning with general histories, not complete histories, but generalized histories of the two presidents. So the president of the Confederacy, Jefferson Davis, and the real president, the president of the United States, Abraham Lincoln, how they eventually came to power, and just some general stuff about them. And then it goes essentially day by day, almost battle by battle, of every conflict, from the smallest skirmishes to the largest bloodbaths of the American Civil War. And so I'm almost near the end of book 1 right now, and there is something that I'm beginning to grasp. It's one of the reasons why I said I love reading about history, because you begin to be, as you gain more context, because the more information that I'm able to take in, the more I'm able to contextualize happenings. There's still Civil War stuff that I want to read that deals with the economics of the time, everyday life for the non-combatants, because I think that's also important to know as well. There were people like the Rockefellers, John D. Rockefeller, who was making money hand over fist during the Civil War. He wasn't involved in the conflict at all. And I want to know what that everyday life was like. But for now, as I've been reading about the conflict and the day-to-day conflicts, I've been able to see what was going on with the soldiers as they had to fight cousins and brothers who just happened to live in different states, or whatever the case may be. And there's something that I've been grasping and gleaning more and more as I study and as I read through this book and listen through it. And it's that racism is so pervasive that for people, they lived completely separately from a psychological standpoint from their deeply embedded racial hatred of Black people and Africans. It was so mundane to them that it was just natural. Of course there are slaves. Thank the good Lord Almighty for providing us with them. That was the thought process back then. They did not regard these other human beings as human beings. They were literally seen in the same eyes that one would see a mule or a donkey or a horse or a cow or a piece of cattle on the farm. That is how they viewed Africans in the South. They were their property. They were beasts of burden to be taken care of by the masters. And those of means would own maybe between 3 and 5 slaves. Obviously, larger plantations and operations had sometimes hundreds of them. But that's where this is all coming from. That's where this all stems from. They saw them essentially as the lowest of the low. And it was so mundane to them, their racism was so ingrained that when they were fighting, they really and truly, like Confederate soldiers really and truly believed they were fighting off federal troops and Union soldiers because they were invading their homeland to force an unnatural way of life onto them. That is what they really in their heart of hearts believed. They saw the Negroes as so less than despicable that there's no way that the Union soldiers were coming in for anything other than to, as they called it, to push that brutish abolitionist cause. They saw the abolitionists as brutes. They saw their cause as unworthy and thought that their institution of slavery was blessed by God. They thought that God was on their side. That is where they were coming from psychologically. And to think that that is the case, where you have these people that are so brainwashed, have sown this hateful ideology so deeply into their DNA that they lose sight of it altogether, it doesn't become hard to realize why things are the way they are right now. The injuries, the thought process, the injury to the mind caused by racism and racial hatred has been so deeply ingrained into society at such a level that to even be where we are right now, I'm not going to say it's a miracle, but we forget, man, and it's one of the things that I think bothers me the most, is that wealthy racists in this country have their racism pardoned away. There are racist politicians right now. Steve King is a racist. Mitch McConnell is a racist. I'm not afraid or ashamed to say that because it's the truth. I'm sick of us lying about these people to try and pretend. The reason why we haven't been able to come far is because everyone just lies and pretends. But like, The richest racists among us have been running society for a while. It's the reason why slavery was a thing. It wasn't just like, oh, back then everyone hated black people. No, slavery stopped being a thing because back then there were white folks called the abolitionists. They were men of honor like a John Brown who were willing to die for the cause of eradicating slavery from these shores. And he still wasn't able to do it because slavery still persists. Slavery is still constitutionally legalized in our country under the 13th Amendment as punishment of crime. One of the worst legal loopholes in all of human history. And Congress has never attempted to try and fix that. They've never said, yo, we're going to eradicate slavery totally. Everyone has just gone on and said, yeah, like if you commit a crime, you deserve to be a literal legal slave, chattel, property of the state. That's all that ever happened in our country, is that slavery was taken out of the private industry and it was put back into public hands. It was made a function of the state. And then guess what? Private industry re-entered the slave trade via private prisons. Like, it's not hard to see this stuff. But because, and as I said, racism is this form of insidious mass psychosis to me, where it's so deeply ingrained in people's subconscious and conscious minds that they're not even able to see. Like, oh my God, I've done and said this racist thing, or I think these racist thoughts, or my heart rate picks up when I walk past a black person on the street. Like, this stuff it's real, man. And it's deeply embedded into our society. And to be honest with you, it is one of the greatest forms of mass psychological delusion that I've ever encountered in all my studies of human history. The fact that just based on the amount of melanin per square centimeter of skin, because it's not just here, it happens in India as well. Their caste system is a little bit more stringent and direct. It happens all over the world, in fact. But here in America, the amount of melanin you have literally dictates your standing as a citizen. Black or brown, then you're probably somewhere down on the totem pole. It's so bad that we have acceptable forms of racism. We don't like to talk about that, but it's acceptable to be racist towards Arab Americans, towards Mexican Americans. It's more taboo to be racist towards African Americans, but all that's happened is that the racism gets swept under the rug, so people just find more and more subtle ways to do it. That looks like loan applications that get denied at far higher rates, business loan applications that get denied at a far higher rate. It looks like proportionally police killings in terms of percentage of population represented in the death data, which they technically don't even have to report, but we've already talked about that in another episode. But like, there's so much that takes place that is so shameful, and it's all based on the color of people's skins that it's hard to really get into fully. And it's something that I'm probably going to discuss in some future episodes, because it may need an entire episode to itself where I can really bring you guys the full details. Forget about just how it was codified into our ways of life, but how it's so insidious that it's hard for people to recognize it within themselves in the modern day, where people get more upset at being called a racist than in seeing racist things happen. How every time you see a post on social media that represents unfairness or racism, that people get more up in arms about the fact that racism as an accusation is being lobbed than the fact that racism is actually causing a disparagement and discrepancy in the way someone or a group of people are treated. I mean, it is what it is in that regard. We're going to move on to our final topic of the day, because we are running short on time, and that is the case against war as an economic tool. People, the truth is, wars have historically served many purposes across the centuries. And my fear is that we constantly fall for the tricks of those who are set at the highest points of society. We constantly fall for their tricks and go off and kill each other for nothing more than political and economic gain for those that have. We don't ever like to talk about that, right? We don't ever like to discuss the fact that wars have traditionally and historically been fought by the poor and maybe the middle class to a degree against other poor and middle class people from other countries, while the rich can either pay some kind of tax to get out of having to serve, whatever the case may be. And moreover, we're always given a cause, something to align ourselves with. So back in classical empires, the start of written and recorded history, you were fighting on the behalf of the glory of the empire, whether it was Greece and fighting on behalf of your city-state and the glory of your city-state, whether that's Athens or Sparta. You have the Roman Empire and you have the legions that are fighting for the glory of Rome. And then after that, you have the Roman Catholic Church that convinces people that they are fighting a massive holy war against Islam and the Muslims from Africa and the Middle East. And so for hundreds of years, we have these crusades that get waged in the name of God. The same God by a different name, because all Allah means is God. It's just God in Arabic. It wasn't the specific name for some alternate God. It's just like saying that Dios in Spanish is another God. No, it's just the word for God. But for millennia now, the wealthiest and most powerful in society, via their ability to, I guess, pay other people, have convinced soldiers and mercenaries and things like that to go off and kill for money, for the glory of God and country. And we keep on falling into that same trap. But what happened, especially after World War II, was a metastasis of this policy, which is to say that they realized, especially in times of war, that the economy boomed. People produced goods for war, so they were producing weaponry, clothing, and food and rations. You were able to employ more people in a state of war. It kept the economies afloat. And so after World War II, the US, our country, has been in essentially a perpetual state of war. From Korea to Cuba to Vietnam, Laos, and Cambodia, to Afghanistan, to Iraq, to Afghanistan and Iraq again, and the many other conflicts from which American arms are sold to other countries, or our soldiers have participated directly in those conflicts, lending support and whatnot. And this is a case against it. I think as a society, as people, we should have enough context of history to know now the pointlessness of war. War is an exercise of psychopathic rich people seeking to extract resources from locations around the globe, and they're able to recruit politicians and the military structures of nation states in their aims, ambitions, and goals. And at this point, we should have enough historical context that soldiers should willingly just lay down arms and say, you know what, no, I'm not going to kill this person I've never met because you tell me they're my enemy. Do I think it'll happen? Who knows? I don't know. I can't guarantee and assure it. But I do think that we have to, at a certain point, realize that keeping ourselves in a constant state of war, sowing killings and casualties abroad, is a karmic debt that it's going to be borderline impossible to pay. As a society, we can't sit down and continue to claim innocence and ignorance of what our country does around the world, what our politicians do around the world. We can't lie to ourselves forever, as much as some people would like us to. And so I'd like to make the case that when we have politicians calling for war in other nations, they've outed themselves as enemies of humanity. Those are people with whom power cannot and should not ever be trusted, because those are the same kind of people that will send your sons, daughters, brothers, sisters, mothers, fathers off to war to die, while their stock jumps up a third of a point, while their holdings increase just a little more. And I, for one, am sick of being any kind of pawn or chess piece in the games of rich psychopaths and sociopaths. We're going to end with our final thought for the day. It's going to be relatively quick this week. And that final thought for the day is to take care of your health. I know it's stressful being alive, not only in this time, but in most times throughout history. Whether we believe it or not, we actually do live in one of the best times in history relative to other points in history. But one of the things that I find gets ignored by most people because of the stress of everyday life is your literal health. And I know that we're taught to work and work and work, and who needs sleep and all this? I'll sleep when I'm dead. But when you're dead, there's nothing else you can do. And I, for one, have seen too many people sacrifice their health in the pursuit of wealth, only to gain maybe a portion of the wealth they were seeking and then lose the ability to enjoy it. So I just want to encourage you. Remember this week, as you're going through the week, try and drink at least 3 to 4 bottles of water a day. Walk around a little bit. Get up and stretch if you work a desk job. Make sure you're staying active somehow. That promise that you made yourself to go to the gym, it's not an impossible one. You just have to do the baby steps. You don't have to go in there and try and do a 2-hour workout all at once. Go in there and lift some weights for 15 minutes. Do that for 1 week. The next week, do 20 minutes. Just get out there and get active. Pay attention to what you're putting into your body and your mind, because your mental health matters too, just as much as your physical health. And that's my final thought for this week. I hope that you guys have enjoyed the show. For those who have been with us here for our inaugural YouTube broadcast, thank you guys for being with us. For those listening in on the radio, thank you as always for being here with us. Look forward to speaking to you guys again soon. But until then, go through this week. Remember to be good to yourselves, be kind and show love to your neighbors. Take care of yourselves. And as always, God bless.
God.